Hello there, this is Cridical from Cridical Media. Just taking a look at Junji story collection of Shiver. This is the 2023 release, although they have been printing it since 2017. And what we usually do at this channel is give you an idea of what to expect if you ever come across these books in the wild. So we go over the exterior, some bonus material, art and plot points, and then a brief review at the end. Now this one, originally published by Asahi Shimbun, it does collect stories from like 1989, a few from the mid-90s, and I think the latest story is like from 2003. But another little side note here, for those of you returning to the channel, I myself have noticed this too, that usually when I do some sort of Junji material, almost always in the comments it's, have you ever read Shiver? Are you going to do a video on Shiver? That kind of thing. So I guess this is partially dedicated to you guys. And to maybe give you a little window into, the books I purchase versus the books I don't. This is a good example because for the longest while, I've always looked at this book as getting it in the form of like overlap. Like I've read it online already, like many years ago, but I always felt the overlap with the Tomi story, Painter. It was always the detractor for me since I have the White Clad over here. But you know what? Honestly, my local comic book shop had a sale. It was cheap enough for me to consider, just might as well pick it up. So here we are today. So there's your little window into the mind of Cridical. But anywho, back into the nature of this channel. In terms of the exterior, very familiar ground, although one very interesting aspect. Even though this is the 2023 release, Viz Media still prints it with the term selected stories as opposed to the other story collection releases. So I don't know, maybe they just want to make this one unique always, who knows. But yeah, very familiar design on the mat, a familiar gloss spine there, and of course a very uniform, exterior. So not bad there, at least they're nice and lined up for each other. But of course the bookends being what they are, not much going on there, but I do appreciate the blue. That's a nice little touch. But in terms of bonus material, like the others, not too much in terms of the exterior of the book, just an afterword. However, they did kind of wed a little taste of, a little bit of bonus material at the end of each story. And speaking of which, being a story collection, maybe it's wise to take a look at the contents. So yeah, it starts off with a very strong narrative with, of course, used record, the titular story Shiver, the introduction of Fushi through, of course, fashion model, the hanging blimp story, marionette mansion, the aforementioned Tomi story and Painter, so the same one that's in that collection. Of course, the long dream, my personal favorite, honored ancestors, Greased, and at least a story from 2015 with fashion model, a little bonus. But one thing I appreciate about each story is it has this, of course, painted Edo aesthetic on each cover, very on point. And being the first story called used record, it is really what it is. So it does follow this vehicle character, Nakayama. It's just her and her friend, as you would imagine, as per the title. They just find this record. It's there's no artist label, there's no record label on it. It's really just a blank disc basically. But ultimately, they find the song is so addictive but haunting at the same time, and can't help but hear it. It almost goes on a Lord of the Rings kind of tip, the whole Smeagol thing where they have to have it. She has to take it. So yeah, it even causes a little strife between the friends here, as you can see, even to causing blows. But I appreciate that being set in the 90s. It still has that issue where, yeah, even in the 90s, because CDs were starting to take over anyway, it is hard to find a record player, At least that's her ambition, just trying to get it recorded so she has her own copy. But eventually, she ends up here, there, a jazz club, whatever. And they kind of use the jazz club as a way of, delivering the exposition on, the origins of this song and how, the haunting tale of how it was recorded, why it has that effect. But I do appreciate by the end of the story, it has that little bit of, metaphysical aspect to it. I'll let you read it to fully enjoy that. But to give you a taste of each story's, bonus features. Yeah, it's just a commentary here, but very insightful, very brief, but yeah, it gives a bit of a history lesson. Also, his motivations behind the story. And yeah, just the way he would, panel out the tale. So I appreciate that they have that little extra touch for every story. But on to the next one, the, titular Shiver story. Personally, it's not my favorite narrative overall. But I will say, you probably get a lot of detailed art, probably the most detailed work throughout the entire book here. So perhaps that's its earning of its title here. But it does start off with this narrative, just, a very insulated story. So it has this awesome establishing shot here. And it's just about this girl, she's suffering an affliction. It's just a neighbor, just, I guess perusing things. And yeah, it's just experiencing this weird dialogue between them. And also just this weird ailment where it looks like spots on her arm, but they're actually holes in her arm. Hence, I guess, where the chills or where the shiver comes from. But one thing I appreciate about this story is that it has a lot of subtext in it. Even though it's not a dense story, there's this one aspect here. Let me just go to this page. Yes. I love this particular layout because even though it looks pretty pedestrian, it's interesting how Ito did actually sell the idea that something else is going on. So once again, that's just good storytelling in general. But yeah, very appreciative of it. Probably one of the craziest, best parts of it, best detailed aspects, is just how much, as you can see, this person's literally being deteriorated. But the way how, even the placement of the eye, the way the person's falling apart from the inside and you could see it, that's high detail. Bravo. But anywho, moving on to the next one, fashion model. I swear Ito used this concept where, if you ever see like a picture of someone on a wall or something, and you feel like the eyes are always following you, I feel like that's exactly what he was going for here. So yeah, it just follows these, I guess, amateur filmmakers. You know what? They're just looking for a starlet to be in their next film. One of the screenwriter just happens to pick up a magazine. He sees, all these pretty girls, but then he keeps continuing to see Fushi, this very gaunt looking, very large looking woman, right? And yeah, it's constantly in his mind and whatnot, literally haunting him as it is. And I will admit, this is more so a straight up monster story, like hands down. But yeah, probably one of my favorite images in it is just this one that alludes to what might or may not happen, if it's all in their heads or not. But yeah, very haunting. If he used an aesthetic of of basing this character off of a shark or something, mission successful, because that's exactly how it comes off. But yeah, very trippy by the end. Very graphic, those ones. Anything to do with Fushi usually. And speaking of a graphic image, this cover for Hanging Blimp, aside from being striking, I love this particular story. Because it's pretty much in line with one of my favorite Junji Ito stories of them all, Remina, which is a masterclass of pacing. This particular tale follows it perfectly, because it is constantly moving. You're going to get that kind of impression. But one thing I like, it starts off at the end with this, very, claustrophobic kind of aspect, and then it begins to reveal its narrative from the beginning. So yeah, it just follows Kazuko. Unfortunately, one of her friends passes away. Seems like a suicide kind of scenario, although it does seem like there's more going on. But I appreciate how, again, with these red herrings of Ito, he implies like it's going to be one kind of story, like maybe a little lovey-dovey type story. But then it turns out to be this very haunting scenario. Like, it looks so cartoony with these floating heads coming out of nowhere. And then just how much the scenario seems more and more like in depth and more threatening. And I appreciate how it starts off as this little microcosm. Like, it's this little scenario in a village, and then it becomes like a big national event. But as mentioned, like, the story always seems moving, not just as a narrative, but even like the kinetics of it. Because this is such a convincing shot of her and her friends. They were just talking, and then these floating heads come out of nowhere. And they just snatch up two of her friends like they're nothing. And yeah, the line work really does convince you of the effect, the speed, the threat of it all. I always felt bad for one of the characters, Chiharu. But nonetheless, this story, another thing about it is it's exceptionally long too. So it's actually a good thing. I'm surprised that it holds up so well. And it can look super zany at times, admittedly. But an underlying theme I find with this particular collection is it seems like it's following those seven deadly sins. You know, we had like a story about, you know, avarice, greed. We had, of course, the vanity. And this one I'd say is more so towards sloth. Because it's ultimately like just a constant aspect of giving up your responsibilities, it seems. So yeah, it just starts off with this character here. Forgive me, Haruhiko. And I guess Yukihiko is his older brother. But yeah, basically the main vehicle character, Haru, he's more so like the very straight-laced one. You know, very, very composed. And yeah, just a lot of them don't want to be in this scenario, this traveling entertainment family. You know, just being a bunch of puppeteers, the titular Jean-Pierre, creepy puppet and whatnot. But yeah, I like how they kind of show you how crazy their life can be. You know, just being upended every 2 seconds, you know, and then does a little bit of a flash forward. And then they somehow, the oldest brother becomes an extreme fan of these things. You see this weird puppet again, this almost Mr. Punch aesthetic to the design. It's super creepy. Man, yeah, very convincing. But yeah, like I said, it just seems like a story where it's just a bunch of characters that just gave up on any sort of responsibility once they attained whatever they got. It's very unique in that sense, and it's so interesting, like how quickly people give up their freedoms in it. Awesome narrative, I will say. But yeah, the idea and the concept is probably the better part. Now, this particular story, again from the original Tomy run, it's basically originally it's my initial deterrence from it. But for those of you who aren't aware of Tomy, essentially the character is this demon parasite. It's basically a succubus. That's how she operates. Beautiful, she allures people in, and she finds a way to destroy them psychologically and physically in some cases. So yeah, she's very, very, very much a manipulative person. But yeah, in this case, it does play with an idea that was already used before, where, you know, if you try to take a picture of her, if you try to draw Tomy, if you try to build a sculpture of her, something weird will happen to it. Like basically the image will come out with some sort of oddity, let's just put it that way. But it is par for course. Like, I don't know, maybe it's only because I've experienced it so many times when I read this. Perhaps it just didn't have the same effect as it did before. But nonetheless, in this one, yes, this is probably my favorite of the bunch, The Long Dream. I love this concept. So aside from this awesome staging point before the narrative truly begins, yes, this whole introduction is just to establish it's all happening in a hospital. It's these patients who, anytime they go to sleep, it's like time for them inside the dream just seems longer and longer and longer. It's kind of like Inception when they went a dream within a dream kind of thing. But essentially, like, years go by for some of these patients, and it's kind of crazy when you think about it. Like, one of these patients, like, they've experienced like decades, to the point where when they wake up in the morning, they forget where they are, why they're there, and whatnot, because it's like they traveled back in time. But yeah, super crazy idea, and I love how deep and how detailed they can get this particular one. But yeah, awesome design. Even though you think, oh, is that a monster? No, like the real monster reveals itself by the end. Awesome kind of concept there. Now, Honored Ancestors. Admittedly, not my favorite of the bunch. I'd say it's mainly because Ito kind of shows his hand from the very beginning. Literally the beginning. Personally, I feel like he telegraphed the entire story just based off the first page. You could say that's sometimes a good thing, but at the same time, for this particular story, it didn't work. Just starts off with a character who has amnesia. Of course, his neighbor, or her friend, drops her off, and lo and behold, like, it just goes down this weird, very odd narrative. You'd think it's a monster story. It's just not as compelling as you'd probably expect it to be, at least in my opinion. I wish it was a little bit better, personally. And speaking of which, Greased Oil, the final main story. This is, I believe, from the 2003, the latest of the bunch. But yeah, it's very similar to that Marionette Mansion, where it's this, just a single father raising two kids. He has a restaurant, I guess fried chicken or something like that. and there's a lot of oil in the place that the what's it called, the house that they live above it is just constantly like a smog of oil. And she's got this super annoying brother who's obsessed with oil himself. He chugs it by the gallon kind of thing. This one's more of like a shock value, gross out value, I'd say, more than it's trying to be anything else. And yes, I so do not want to turn the page on that one. I guess it does work. It is a gross out one because I don't want to read it because of that reason. But that's just me. If you guys can stomach it, by all means. But that's why I appreciate that they ended it with this particular story. Again, a return to the fashion model concept. So this one's a little bit later, 2015 actually. And you can definitely tell like Ito's gotten much better at this point. His art looks cleaner in general. And not to mention he knows exactly what to fill each space with. So awesome in that sense. While still feeling quite familiar to his aesthetic. But yeah, just a nice brief one. Again, the return of Fushi here. And a very brutal ending, no less. But again, because it's so short, the brevity kind of helps it when it hits that big moment. But anywho, yes, finally I did the Shiver video like some of y'all wanted me to. Yes, it is really awesome. Aside from those 2 MacGuffin stories, yeah, it's a pretty strong release overall. And yeah, a little bit of the overlap with Tomi is just my own personal thing. If I probably didn't have the whole Tomi White Clad, I'd probably feel a little bit different. But anywho, it's no longer about me at this point. Maybe you guys have your own opinions. Maybe another book of Ito's to suggest. But nonetheless, I wouldn't mind hearing your comments down below, as always. Y'all folks take care and enjoy the rest of your day.